On the morning of March 17, 1986, in a quiet neighborhood barbershop in Arlington, Virginia, Thomas Mitchell carefully draped the white cape around the shoulders of his newest customer, a well-dressed man who introduced himself as Richard Coleman. The spring sunlight filtered through the storefront windows, casting long shadows across the black and white checkered floor. Mitchell had no idea that this routine Tuesday morning appointment would unravel one of the most carefully constructed false identities in Cold War espionage history, exposing a KGB double agent who had operated undetected for nearly 8 years. Coleman believed he had perfected every aspect of his American persona, from his flawless Midwestern accent to his encyclopedic knowledge of baseball statistics. He never imagined that a simple conversation about childhood memories would be his undoing. What began as small talk between a barber and his client would transform into a counterintelligence breakthrough that sent shockwaves through both the FBI and the Soviet intelligence apparatus, proving that sometimes the most elaborate spy operations collapse not through sophisticated surveillance or cryptographic breakthroughs, but through the smallest, most human of details. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Thomas Mitchell had owned Mitchell's Barbershop on Wilson Boulevard for 23 years. At 51 years old, he had cut the hair of everyone from high school students to Pentagon officials, from construction workers to intelligence analysts who worked at the various government agencies that dotted the Northern Virginia landscape. His shop had become something of an institution in the neighborhood, a place where men could relax, read the morning paper, and enjoy the ritual of a proper haircut and straight razor shave. Mitchell took pride in his craft. He had learned the trade from his father, who had opened the original Mitchell's Barbershop in downtown Washington back in 1941. The younger Mitchell had inherited not just the business acumen and technical skills, but also his father's genuine interest in people. He remembered names, faces, and personal details with remarkable accuracy. Regular customers appreciated how he could pick up conversations from weeks earlier, asking about a daughter's college applications or a son's Little League games. The barbershop itself reflected Mitchell's attention to detail and respect for tradition. Red leather barber chairs purchased in the 1950s and meticulously maintained dominated the space. Old photographs of Arlington hung on the walls, showing the neighborhood's transformation from farmland to suburb over the decades. A vintage radio, usually tuned to a local news station, sat on a shelf alongside neatly arranged bottles of bay rum aftershave and pomade. The shop smelled of talcum powder, hot lather, and the faint tang of the disinfectant solution where combs and scissors soaked between customers. On that particular March morning, Mitchell had already served 3 regular customers. The morning rush had been steady, but manageable. He was wiping down his station when the bell above the door chimed, announcing a new arrival. The man who entered wore a well-tailored dark suit, carried a leather briefcase, and projected an air of quiet confidence. He appeared to be in his late 30s, with dark hair showing the first hints of gray at the temples. "Good morning," Mitchell said, gesturing to the empty chair. "Take a seat. I'll be right with you." "Thank you," the man replied, settling into the chair and placing his briefcase carefully beside him. His voice carried what Mitchell's experienced ear identified as a neutral American accent, the kind that news anchors cultivated, devoid of regional characteristics. "I'm Tom Mitchell," the barber said, shaking the white cape open with a practiced snap before draping it over the customer. "Haven't seen you in here before, new to the area." "Richard Coleman," the man said, extending his hand before the cape fully covered it. "I've been working in the area for a while, but I usually went to a place closer to my office. Figured I'd try somewhere new." "Well, you came to the right place," Mitchell said with a warm smile. "What are we doing today?" "Just a trim, nothing too short, clean up the sides and back, leave some length on top." Mitchell nodded and began his work, running a comb through Coleman's hair to assess its texture and growth pattern. As he worked, he fell into the comfortable rhythm of conversation that had characterized thousands of haircuts over his career. "So where are you from originally?" Mitchell asked, his scissors moving with practiced precision. "Cleveland," Coleman answered smoothly. Grew up there, went to Ohio State, then bounced around a bit before settling here in the D.C. area. Cleveland, huh? My cousin lived there for a while, worked at the steel mills. Tough city, especially with the winters. That's for sure, Coleman agreed. The lake effect snow could be brutal. I remember one winter when I was a kid, must have been 63 or 64. We got hit with so much snow the schools were closed for a week. Mitchell continued cutting, listening attentively as he always did. Coleman seemed relaxed, perhaps too relaxed. He talked about growing up in Cleveland with the kind of detail that suggested genuine nostalgia, recounting memories of sledding on the hills near his childhood home, summer trips to Cedar Point Amusement Park, and attending Indians games with his father at Municipal Stadium. You remember the Indians pennant race in '54? Mitchell asked, testing the man's knowledge as he moved around to trim the other side. Before my time, Coleman said with a slight laugh. I was born in '52, so I was only 2 years old, but my dad talked about it constantly. That was their last World Series appearance until, well, they still haven't made it back, have they? Not yet, Mitchell confirmed. He paused, tilting his head slightly as something nagged at the edge of his consciousness. He continued working, sweeping the comb through Coleman's hair, but his mind had engaged in a different kind of sorting through memories. So you said you went to Ohio State? Mitchell asked, keeping his tone conversational. That's right. Class of '74, majored in political science. Beautiful campus. I visited there once back in '68 when my daughter was looking at colleges. She ended up going to Maryland, but we made a whole trip of it, visiting several schools. Ohio State really impressed me. That big oval in the middle of campus, and the football stadium was just massive. Coleman nodded enthusiastically, said, the horseshoe. Nothing quite like watching a game there on a fall Saturday. Mitchell continued trimming, but his experienced barber's mind, trained through decades of careful observation and countless conversations, had caught something that didn't quite align. It was nothing obvious, nothing that would have registered with most people. But Mitchell had spent his entire adult life in this chair, listening to people's stories, and he had developed an almost unconscious ability to detect inconsistencies in the narratives people told. The problem was subtle. Coleman had described growing up in Cleveland with vivid, specific details. He knew about Cedar Point, about the lake effect snow, about Municipal Stadium. But there was something slightly off about the way he talked about these memories. The details were correct, but they lacked a certain emotional texture, as though they had been learned rather than lived. More concerning, when Coleman talked about Ohio State, he had mentioned the oval and the football stadium with a kind of enthusiasm that felt rehearsed. Mitchell remembered his own visit to Ohio State very clearly, and while he had been impressed by the campus, he distinctly recalled that it was his daughter who had used the nickname the horseshoe for the stadium. Mitchell himself wouldn't have known that detail if she hadn't pointed it out. What really caught Mitchell's attention, though, was something even more subtle. When Coleman had mentioned the winter storm of '63 or '64, he had described it in general terms. Schools closed for a week, brutal snow, typical lake effect weather. But Mitchell's cousin had actually lived in Cleveland during that period, and Mitchell distinctly remembered the conversation they'd had about the specific storm Coleman seemed to be referencing. That storm, which hit Cleveland in January of 1964, had indeed been severe, but what made it particularly memorable was not just the snow accumulation, but the fact that it had come with a power outage that lasted for days. Anyone who had actually lived through that storm as a child would remember the power outage. The darkness, the cold houses, the families huddled around fireplaces, these were the details that stuck with people. Coleman hadn't mentioned any of that. Mitchell continued working, maintaining his friendly demeanor while his mind raced. He could be overthinking this. People's memories were imperfect. Maybe Coleman simply didn't remember the power outage, or maybe he wasn't thinking about that particular storm. But Mitchell's instincts, honed through years of reading people, told him something was not quite right. The barber decided to probe a little deeper, but carefully. Arlington, Virginia in 1986 was a community acutely aware of the ongoing Cold War tensions. The Soviet Union remained a formidable adversary, and the previous year, 1985, had been dubbed the Year of the Spy by the press after numerous espionage cases had come to light. Just a few months earlier, in November, the case of John Walker, a Navy warrant officer who had sold encrypted communications to the Soviets, had shocked the nation. Walker's spy ring had operated for 18 years, compromising some of the nation's most sensitive naval communications. The revelation had made everyone more security conscious, more aware that Soviet intelligence operatives were actively working to penetrate American institutions. Mitchell, like many in the area who served government employees, had developed an informal awareness of the kinds of behavioral tells that might suggest someone was not who they claimed to be. The FBI had even given presentations at community centers, warning citizens to report unusual behavior or inconsistencies in people's stories. It wasn't paranoia, it was the reality of living in the shadow of the intelligence community during the height of the Cold War. "So what line of work are you in?" Mitchell asked, moving to work on the back of Coleman's head. "I'm a policy analyst," Coleman said. "Work for a consulting firm that does contract work for various government agencies. A lot of reports, briefings, that sort of thing. Pretty dry stuff, honestly." "Sounds interesting to me," Mitchell said. "Must require security clearances and all that." "Some of the work does, yes. Nothing too exotic, just the standard background checks and paperwork." Mitchell nodded, continuing to cut. The answer had been smooth, confident, exactly what someone in that position would say. But again, something felt rehearsed about it, as though Coleman had prepared for exactly these kinds of questions. The barber decided to try one more test, something more specific that would require genuine lived experience rather than researched knowledge. "You know what I remember about Cleveland?" Mitchell said, keeping his tone light and conversational. "When I visited my cousin there, he took me to this restaurant, I think it was on the west side. Served the best pierogies I've ever had. Little place, family run. They had this specific way of preparing them, with this incredible caramelized onion topping. You ever go to a place like that?" I'm trying to remember the name. Mitchell was, in fact, making up the entire anecdote. He watched Coleman's face carefully in the mirror. "Oh, sure," Coleman said after the briefest pause. "There were several places like that. The Polish and Eastern European communities in Cleveland, they had great restaurants. I don't remember the specific name you're thinking of, but yeah, pierogies were definitely a thing." It was a perfectly reasonable response, but it confirmed Mitchell's growing suspicion. Someone who had actually grown up in Cleveland would either remember specific pierogi restaurants with nostalgic detail, or they would admit they hadn't really been into that kind of food as a kid. Coleman's response was too general, too safe. It was the response of someone trying not to make a mistake, rather than someone drawing on actual memories. Mitchell finished the haircut, using the clippers to clean up the neckline, and applying a hot towel to the back of Coleman's neck, before dusting him off with talcum powder. Throughout the process, he maintained his friendly, professional demeanor, but his mind was working through the implications of what he had observed. When Coleman stood up and paid, tipping generously, Mitchell thanked him and told him to come back any time. Coleman smiled, said he certainly would, and left the shop. Mitchell watched through the window as Coleman walked down Wilson Boulevard, briefcase in hand, before disappearing around the corner. For several minutes, Mitchell stood in his empty shop, thinking. He could be completely wrong. Coleman might be exactly who he said he was, a policy analyst from Cleveland who simply had an imperfect memory or different childhood experiences than Mitchell was expecting. Making a false accusation against an innocent person would be terrible, potentially ruining someone's career and life based on nothing more than a barber's hunch. But the inconsistencies nagged at him. The slightly off quality of Coleman's Cleveland memories, the rehearsed feel of his responses, the way he handled the pierogi test, not quite committing to specific knowledge but not admitting ignorance either. And there was something else, something Mitchell had noticed but not fully processed until now. When Coleman had extended his hand for the initial handshake, Mitchell had felt calluses on the man's palm. They weren't the calluses of someone who did manual labor. They were smaller, more specific, located on the fingertips and the base of the thumb. Mitchell had felt calluses like that before, on the hands of musicians, specifically pianists or violinists. That detail by itself meant nothing. Plenty of policy analysts played musical instruments as hobbies, but taken together with everything else, It added to the picture of a man whose current life and stated background didn't quite align. A policy analyst from Cleveland who played classical music had perfect but slightly artificial-feeling memories of his childhood and answered questions with the careful precision of someone working from a script. Mitchell walked to the phone on the wall near the cash register. He stared at it for a long moment, weighing his decision. If he was wrong, he would waste the FBI's time and possibly cause problems for an innocent man. But if he was right, and he said nothing, a potential intelligence threat would continue operating undetected. The previous year's spy cases weighed on his mind. John Walker had operated for 18 years before being caught. How much damage might have been prevented if someone had reported their suspicions earlier? The country was in the middle of a sustained intelligence war with the Soviet Union, even if it was being fought in the shadows rather than on battlefields. Mitchell picked up the phone and dialed the number for the FBI's Washington field office. He had the number memorized, something that was not unusual for business owners in the area. The FBI encouraged citizens to report suspicious activity, and they had provided contact information through various community outreach programs. When an agent answered, Mitchell explained who he was and said he wanted to report something unusual, though he emphasized he might be mistaken. The agent listened patiently, then asked Mitchell to describe the interaction in detail. Mitchell went through the entire conversation, explaining his observations about Coleman's responses, the subtle inconsistencies in his Cleveland memories, and the overall impression of rehearsed authenticity. "Can you describe this individual?" the agent asked. Mitchell provided a detailed description. Late 30s, approximately 6 feet tall, dark hair with grey at the temples, well-built but not overtly muscular, no distinguishing marks visible, wearing a dark suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He also mentioned the calluses he had noticed. And he said his name was Richard Coleman. That's what he told me. Did he pay with cash or credit card? Cash. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then the agent said, "Mr. Mitchell, thank you for calling this in. I want you to know that we take all reports seriously. Someone will likely follow up with you in the next few days to get a more detailed statement. In the meantime, if this individual returns to your shop, act naturally and call us immediately after he leaves. Do not attempt to detain him or question him further. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," Mitchell said. "And Mr. Mitchell, please don't discuss this with anyone. Not your family, not your other customers. Understood?" "I understand." After hanging up, Mitchell felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. He had done what he thought was right, but he couldn't shake the fear that he had just set in motion events that might turn out to be based on nothing more than his own overactive imagination. 3 days later, on Friday morning, 2 men in dark suits entered the barber shop just as Mitchell was opening. They showed him FBI credentials and asked if they could speak with him privately. Mitchell locked the door, flipped the sign to closed, and led them to the small office in the back of the shop. The 2 agents introduced themselves as Special Agent Robert Carson and Special Agent James Martinez. Carson was older, perhaps in his early 50s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested years of difficult work. Martinez was younger, mid-30s, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the cluttered office. "Mr. Mitchell," Carson began, settling into the folding chair that Mitchell kept for when he did paperwork, "we want to thank you for your call earlier this week. I also want to tell you that your observations were extremely valuable." Mitchell felt his pulse quicken, said, "So I wasn't imagining things?" "No, sir." "You were not," Martinez said, pulling out a small notebook. "The man you described, the one who called himself Richard Coleman, is someone we've been investigating for several months. We believe he's a KGB illegal operating under deep cover." The term illegal in intelligence parlance referred to an intelligence officer operating without diplomatic protection, someone who had assumed a false identity and integrated into the target society without the cover of embassy or consular employment. These were among the most dangerous and difficult operatives to detect, as they often spent years building their cover identities before being activated for intelligence gathering. Mitchell felt the blood drain from his face, said, "You're telling me I gave a haircut to a Russian spy?" "That's exactly what we're telling you," Carson said. "And your sharp eye and good instincts may have helped us build the case we need to arrest him." We'd like to go through everything you observed, every detail you can remember." For the next 2 hours, Mitchell recounted the entire interaction. The agents took extensive notes, asking questions about specific phrases Coleman had used, the exact nature of the inconsistencies Mitchell had noticed, and the physical details he had observed. They were particularly interested in Mitchell's observation about the calluses on Coleman's hands. "Classical music training," Martinez explained. "Our subject, his real name is Viktor Dmitrievich Sokolov, grew up in Leningrad. His father was a violinist with the Leningrad Philharmonic. Viktor trained on the violin from age 5 until he was recruited by the KGB at 23. Those calluses are the kind that never quite go away, even after years of not playing regularly." Carson pulled out several photographs and spread them on the desk. "Is this the man who came into your shop?" Mitchell studied the photos. They showed the same individual he had served, captured from various angles and in different settings. In some photos he was entering or leaving buildings. In others, he was meeting with other individuals in what appeared to be restaurants or parks. "That's him," Mitchell confirmed. "That's the man who said he was Richard Coleman." "We've been watching Sokolov for 7 months," Carson explained. "Ever since we received a tip from a Soviet defector that the KGB had an illegal operating in the northern Virginia area. The defector couldn't give us a name or specific details, just that there was someone here, someone with access to government contractors and policy circles." Martinez continued the explanation. "We've been trying to identify him, but he's good, very good. He's built an almost perfect cover. Richard Coleman's credentials check out, his employment history checks out, even his credit history and tax records check out. The KGB set him up thoroughly. They gave him what we call a legend, a complete false biography backed up with documents and planted evidence. If you run his name through normal databases, you'll find a Richard Coleman from Cleveland who attended Ohio State and has worked in the D.C. area for 8 years. The paperwork is flawless." "So how do you know he's not really Richard Coleman?" Mitchell asked. "Because of inconsistencies like the ones you spotted," Carson said. "We've been investigating everyone who might fit the profile the defector provided. We've been looking at men between 35 and 45, single or claiming to be divorced, working in policy or consulting fields with access to government contracts. That describes about 2,000 people in the Northern Virginia area. We've been interviewing people, checking backgrounds, looking for anything that doesn't quite fit," Martinez added. "But Sokolov, or Coleman as he calls himself, he's been very careful. He doesn't make obvious mistakes. He knows the details of his legend thoroughly. He can talk about Cleveland, about Ohio State, about his fictitious childhood. He's studied American culture extensively, but he can't quite replicate the authentic texture of lived experience, the unconscious knowledge that comes from actually growing up somewhere." Carson leaned forward in his chair, said, "That's what you picked up on, Mr. Mitchell, the difference between learned knowledge and lived experience. Most people wouldn't notice it, but you've spent your career reading people, listening to their stories, understanding the nuances of how people talk about their lives. You noticed what Sokolov's KGB handlers couldn't teach him, the genuine feel of real memories." Mitchell shook his head slowly, still processing the magnitude of what he had stumbled into. "What exactly has he been doing? What kind of intelligence has he been gathering?" The agents exchanged a glance. Carson said, "We can't share all the operational details, but I can tell you that Sokolov has been cultivating relationships with mid-level officials at several government agencies and defense contractors. He attends conferences, professional gatherings, social events. He befriends people, learns about their work, and occasionally he tries to elicit sensitive information. Nothing that would trigger obvious security concerns, just gradual collection of details that, when pieced together, provide valuable intelligence to Moscow." "The beauty of his operation from the KGB's perspective," Martinez said, "is that he's never asked anyone to break the law or violate their security clearances. He just listens, asks informed questions, and slowly builds a picture of government operations, policy debates, technological developments. The people he talks to don't even realize they're being targeted. They think they're just having professional conversations with a colleague." "So, what happens now?" Mitchell asked. "Now, we have to decide how to proceed," Carson said. Your observations have given us additional confirmation that Coleman is indeed Sokolov. We've been building a case, collecting evidence, conducting surveillance. But we need to be strategic about when and how we move. If we arrest him too soon, without sufficient evidence, his lawyers will get him released and we'll lose our chance. If we wait too long, he might become aware he's under investigation and flee the country. Martinez added, "There's also the question of whether we want to arrest him or use him to feed disinformation back to Moscow. Sometimes it's more valuable to know what the other side is doing and control the information they receive than it is to simply shut down an operation." Over the following weeks, Mitchell continued to operate his barbershop as usual, but he was now part of an active FBI counterintelligence operation. The agents had asked him to call immediately if Sokolov returned for another haircut, and they had installed a small recording device in the shop that could be activated quickly if needed. Mitchell had never imagined when he opened his simple barbershop decades earlier that it would become part of the shadow war between intelligence services. Sokolov never returned to Mitchell's barbershop. The agents later told Mitchell that their surveillance had captured Sokolov walking past the shop several times in the following days, looking through the windows, but he never came inside again. It was possible that he had noticed something in Mitchell's demeanor that final day, some subtle tell that suggested the barber had become suspicious. Or perhaps it was simply operational caution, the ingrained KGB training that taught illegals never to establish too regular a pattern, never to return to the same locations too frequently. The investigation continued for 3 more months. The FBI built their case methodically, documenting Sokolov's meetings, analyzing his communications, and working with the CIA to understand the intelligence priorities that Moscow had assigned to him. They discovered that Sokolov had been collecting information primarily on American policy toward arms control negotiations and strategic defense initiatives. The Reagan administration had proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, popularly known as Star Wars, a satellite-based missile defense system that would theoretically protect the United States from Soviet nuclear weapons. The Soviets were deeply concerned about this program and desperate to understand its technical feasibility and the American government's commitment to funding it. Sokolov had cultivated sources at think tanks, consulting firms, and even within congressional staff who worked on defense appropriations. He never asked these sources to provide classified information. Instead, he asked about policy debates, funding priorities, and the internal arguments occurring within the American government about whether the Strategic Defense Initiative was practical or merely a bargaining chip for arms control negotiations. On June 24, 1986, the FBI made their move. Sokolov was arrested as he left his apartment building in Falls Church, Virginia, at 6:15 in the morning. The arrest was executed by a tactical team that moved with practiced efficiency. Sokolov offered no resistance. According to the agents who conducted the arrest, he seemed almost relieved when they placed him in handcuffs and read him his rights. In his apartment, FBI agents found extensive evidence of his intelligence activities. They discovered a sophisticated communications system hidden in a hollowed-out section of his bookshelf, capable of receiving encrypted messages from Moscow. They found one-time pads used for decoding messages hidden in the spine of a Russian English dictionary. They found 3 different sets of identification documents, each with Sokolov's photograph, but different names and biographical information. They found over $80,000 in cash, distributed in various hiding places throughout the apartment, emergency funds that could be used for a quick escape if his cover was blown. Most significantly, they found detailed notes on his intelligence contacts, written in a combination of Russian and coded English. These notes provided the FBI with a comprehensive map of Sokolov's intelligence network, identifying which individuals he had cultivated and what information he had obtained from each. During his interrogation, Sokolov eventually cooperated with investigators. He was facing charges of espionage, conspiracy, and false statement to federal officials, charges that carried potential life sentences. In exchange for cooperation and a reduced sentence, he provided extensive information about KGB operations in the United States, training methods for illegals, and the procedures for communicating with handlers. He told investigators that he had been recruited by the KGB while attending Leningrad State University. where he had studied American history and political science. He had spent 3 years in intensive training, learning to speak English without a Russian accent, studying American culture, customs, and social norms, and preparing to assume the identity of Richard Coleman. The real Richard Coleman had been a childhood friend of Sokolov's assigned identity, a young man from Cleveland who had died in a car accident at age 22 in 1974, before he had established much of an adult life. The KGB had obtained Coleman's birth certificate and social security number, then carefully constructed an adult history for him. College attendance, job history, credit records, everything needed to create a convincing American identity. Sokolov had entered the United States illegally through Canada in 1978, using false documents. He had then spent several years establishing his cover, taking jobs, building a credit history, creating the paper trail of a normal American life. He had been activated for intelligence gathering in 1982, when he began working for a Washington-based consulting firm that gave him access to government contractor circles and policy communities. He explained that his KGB training had been thorough, but couldn't account for every detail of American life. He had memorized facts about Cleveland, studied maps, learned about local landmarks and history. He had watched American movies and television shows to understand cultural references, but he acknowledged that there was something about authentic American experience that eluded him, a certain casualness and unself-consciousness in how Americans talked about their pasts that he could never quite replicate. When asked about his visit to Mitchell's barbershop, Sokolov admitted that he had felt uneasy during the conversation. He said that Mitchell had asked questions that felt subtly probing, that the barber's casual manner had seemed to mask a sharper intelligence. He had noticed Mitchell watching him carefully in the mirror, had sensed a shift in the atmosphere of the conversation. After leaving the shop, Sokolov had debated whether to report the encounter to his handlers, but he had convinced himself he was being paranoid. He had decided not to return to that barbershop, but he hadn't taken any other evasive action. That decision, that slight hesitation between recognizing danger and acting on it, had given the FBI the time they needed to finalize their case. The case against Viktor Sokolov, though never widely publicized to protect intelligence sources and methods, represented a significant counterintelligence success for the FBI. His arrest and subsequent cooperation provided valuable insights into KGB illegal operations and helped identify weaknesses in Soviet training methods. More broadly, it demonstrated that even the most carefully constructed cover identities had vulnerabilities, that human intuition and attention to subtle details could sometimes accomplish what sophisticated technical surveillance could not. For Thomas Mitchell, the experience transformed his understanding of his role in his community. He had always taken pride in being a good barber, in providing quality service and friendly conversation. He never imagined that those same skills, the careful attention to detail, and the genuine interest in people's stories would make him an inadvertent counterintelligence asset. The FBI recognized Mitchell's contribution with a letter of commendation, though the details of his role remained classified for years. The agents involved in the case occasionally stopped by the barbershop, not just for haircuts, but to thank him personally for his sharp observations. Mitchell never sought publicity for his role. In fact, he was uncomfortable with any attention. He saw what he had done as simply fulfilling his responsibility as a citizen, paying attention and reporting when something seemed wrong. The Sokolov case illustrated a fundamental truth about intelligence work during the Cold War. The contest between the United States and the Soviet Union was fought not just in the halls of power or on distant battlefields, but in ordinary places like barbershops and grocery stores, in the everyday interactions that made up American life. The Soviet Union devoted enormous resources to training illegals like Sokolov, creating elaborate legends, and establishing deep cover identities. The United States, in turn, relied not just on professional intelligence officers, but on alert citizens who noticed when something didn't quite add up. Mitchell's contribution also highlighted the limitations of even the most sophisticated espionage operations. The KGB could forge documents, create paper trails, and teach their agents facts and figures. But they couldn't easily replicate the unconscious authenticity that came from genuinely living a life. Sokolov knew the facts about Cleveland, about Ohio State, about American culture, but he couldn't know them with the casual, unrehearsed quality of someone who had actually experienced them. He couldn't anticipate that a friendly barber in an Arlington shop would be perceptive enough to notice the difference between knowledge and experience. In the years following Sokolov's arrest, Mitchell occasionally thought about that March morning when Richard Coleman walked into his shop. He wondered how many other similar encounters occurred daily across America, how many false identities and carefully constructed legends went undetected because no one happened to ask the right questions or notice the subtle tells. The experience gave him a deeper appreciation for the hidden dimensions of the Cold War, the vast intelligence contest being waged in the shadows while ordinary Americans went about their lives. The case also served as a reminder that espionage was ultimately a human endeavor, dependent on human psychology and vulnerable to human error. Sokolov's training had been excellent, his legend carefully constructed, his discipline strong. But in the end, he couldn't completely overcome the inherent artificiality of his situation. He was a Russian pretending to be an American, and no amount of training could erase the fundamental awkwardness of that deception. Mitchell continued to operate his barbershop for another 12 years, finally retiring in 1998 at the age of 63. By then, the Cold War had ended. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and the urgent vigilance of the mid-1980s had given way to different security concerns. But Mitchell never forgot that spring morning when his professional attentiveness and genuine interest in people had accidentally exposed a carefully hidden threat. The broader implications of the Sokolov case extended beyond the specific intelligence he had gathered. His arrest contributed to a growing understanding within the FBI and CIA of how Soviet illegals operated, what their vulnerabilities were, and how they could be detected. It reinforced the importance of human intelligence and the value of cultivating relationships with citizens who were positioned to notice unusual behavior. The case also illustrated the psychological toll of being an illegal. Sokolov later told investigators that the constant vigilance required to maintain his false identity had been exhausting. Every conversation was a potential minefield. Every question about his past required him to draw on memorized details rather than genuine memories. Every social interaction demanded that he carefully monitor his responses, ensuring they aligned with his legend. The strain of living this double life, always alert to the possibility of exposure, had worn on him over the years. By the time of his arrest, he admitted, part of him was relieved that the charade was over. The arrest had diplomatic ramifications. The United States quietly expelled several Soviet diplomats suspected of being his handlers, part of the ongoing tit-for-tat of Cold War espionage. For the residents of Arlington, Virginia and the surrounding communities, the Sokolov case served as a stark reminder that the global confrontation between superpowers played out in their own neighborhoods. The Soviet threat was not abstract or distant. It was present in the person sitting next to them at a professional conference, the colleague they chatted with at a networking event, the customer who came into their shop for a haircut. This awareness created a certain ambient paranoia, but it also fostered a sense of civic responsibility. People understood that vigilance was not just the job of professional security services, but a shared obligation. The story of how a barber's careful attention to detail helped expose a KGB double agent became, in intelligence circles, a case study in the importance of ordinary citizens in counterintelligence efforts. It demonstrated that sophisticated electronic surveillance and covert operations, while essential, were not sufficient by themselves. The human element, the ability to read people and notice inconsistencies, remained irreplaceable. As Mitchell reflected on the experience in later years, he came to appreciate the strange accident of history that had brought Viktor Sokolov into his barbershop that March morning. If Sokolov had gone to a different barber, one less attentive or less curious, his operation might have continued undetected for years longer. If Mitchell had been busier that day, preoccupied with other concerns, he might not have engaged in such detailed conversation. If he had been less familiar with Cleveland through his cousin's stories, he might not have noticed the subtle gaps in Sokolov's knowledge. The whole thing hinged on a series of small coincidences, which was perhaps how most intelligence breakthroughs actually occurred, not through dramatic confrontations, but through the accumulation of small observations and fortunate accidents. The Sokolov case ultimately became part of the hidden history of the Cold War, one of countless operations and counter-operations that shaped the conflict's outcome without ever being widely publicized. Unlike the dramatic spy cases that made headlines, like the conviction of Aldrich Ames or the exposure of Robert Hanssen, the Sokolov case remained largely classified, known primarily within intelligence communities. This obscurity was partly intentional, designed to protect sources and methods, but it also reflected the nature of counterintelligence work, which often relied on discretion and secrecy rather than publicity. For Thomas Mitchell, the recognition he received from the FBI, though private, meant more to him than any public acclaim could have. He had been trusted with important information, had played a small but significant role in protecting his country, and had conducted himself with the discretion and responsibility that the situation required. These were the qualities he had tried to embody throughout his life, and to have them acknowledged by professionals who understood their importance was deeply satisfying. The relationship between Mitchell and the FBI agents who worked the case evolved into genuine friendship. Special agents Carson and Martinez continued to visit the barber shop even after the case closed, not just for haircuts, but for conversation. They appreciated Mitchell's discretion and his insights into human nature. On several occasions, they consulted him on other matters, asking his opinion about behavioral patterns or inconsistencies in people's stories. Mitchell never officially worked for the FBI, but he became, in his own small way, part of the extended network of citizens who contributed to national security. When Mitchell finally retired and sold his barbershop, Carson and Martinez attended the small retirement party he held for regular customers and friends. They presented him with a plaque, elegantly framed, that read, "In recognition of exceptional service to your country and unwavering dedication to the principles of vigilance and citizenship." The plaque didn't mention specifics, didn't reference the Sokolov case or explain the nature of Mitchell's service, but Mitchell understood its meaning, and he hung it proudly in his home. The barbershop itself continued operating under new ownership. The red leather chairs remained, as did the old photographs of Arlington on the walls. But something intangible had changed. Mitchell's presence, his particular combination of skill, attentiveness, and genuine interest in people, couldn't be replicated. The new owner was competent and friendly, but he didn't have Mitchell's decades of experience reading people, didn't possess that almost unconscious ability to notice when something wasn't quite right. In the years following Mitchell's retirement, as the Cold War faded into history and new security threats emerged, the Sokolov case became a teaching example at FBI training facilities. New counterintelligence agents studied it as an illustration of the importance of human observation and the vulnerabilities inherent in even well-constructed cover identities. The case reinforced several key lessons: that illegals, no matter how thoroughly trained, struggled to fully replicate authentic cultural experience, that ordinary citizens could be valuable assets in identifying suspicious behavior, and that successful counterintelligence required both sophisticated technical capabilities and old-fashioned attentiveness to human nature. The psychological aspects of the case also became subjects of study. Intelligence psychologists analyzed Sokolov's behavior, examining how the cognitive load of maintaining a false identity created subtle tells in speech patterns. These studies contributed to improved methods for detecting illegals, highlighting an enduring truth: human deception, no matter how sophisticated, remained imperfect. For Viktor Sokolov himself, cooperation with American intelligence led to a reduced sentence. He served 11 years in federal prison before being released in 1997. By then, the Soviet Union no longer existed, and Sokolov faced the strange fate of being a man without a country. The Russian Federation, successor to the Soviet Union, showed little interest in a failed KGB agent. His original identity in Russia had been carefully buried as part of his illegal operation, and returning to that life would have been nearly impossible. Upon his release, Sokolov remained in the United States under supervised conditions. He eventually wrote a memoir, published under a pseudonym, describing his experiences as a KGB illegal. The book provided valuable insights into Soviet intelligence operations, but reached only a limited audience, primarily intelligence professionals and espionage historians. Sokolov lived quietly, working as a translator and occasionally consulting for the FBI on counterintelligence matters, helping them understand Soviet training methods and operational procedures. In a surreal twist, Sokolov and Mitchell eventually met years later at an FBI ceremony honoring citizens who had contributed to counterintelligence. The meeting was cordial. Sokolov complimented Mitchell's perceptiveness, acknowledging the Barber had noticed what others missed. Mitchell expressed sympathy for Sokolov's difficult life. This intersection captured something essential about the Cold War's human dimension: real people whose lives intersected through history and geopolitics, without personal animosity, but caught in forces beyond their control. The deeper tragedy of the Cold War revealed itself in how it turned ordinary interactions into potential intelligence operations, requiring people to view neighbors with suspicion. The contest between superpowers was fought through countless small human dramas involving real people shaped by forces beyond their control. The case illustrated the strange intimacy of espionage. Effective spies formed genuine human connections to elicit information, but this very skill created vulnerabilities. To be convincing required authentic engagement, creating opportunities for perceptive observers to notice inconsistencies. The enduring lesson emphasized in FBI training was that counterintelligence required attention and empathy. Agents needed to understand human nature and recognize subtle tells distinguishing genuine interaction from performed authenticity. The case illustrated the broader dynamics of Cold War espionage. Sophisticated threats could be countered by basic human qualities like attention and curiosity. The lessons remained relevant for new generations studying counterintelligence. For the residents of Arlington and Northern Virginia, the Sokolov case eventually became part of local law, a reminder of the area's unique role in Cold War history. The community had always been aware of its proximity to the centers of American power and the concentration of intelligence professionals in the region. The case reinforced this awareness while also highlighting the ordinariness of the setting. A Soviet spy hadn't been caught through dramatic surveillance operations in exotic locations. He had been exposed during a routine haircut in a neighborhood barbershop, brought down by a barber who simply paid attention. Mitchell himself remained ambivalent about this legacy. He took pride in his contribution, but also valued the friendly atmosphere that had characterized his barbershop. The experience had introduced a note of wariness into his interactions, changing something fundamental about how he experienced his work. The story of how Thomas Mitchell exposed Viktor Sokolov ultimately became more than just a counterintelligence success. It became a parable about attention and perception, about the value of everyday expertise, about the hidden complexity of ordinary interactions. It showed that protecting a free society required not just powerful military forces and sophisticated intelligence agencies, but also citizens who paid attention, who trusted their instincts, and who were willing to act when something seemed wrong. In the end, Mitchell's contribution lay not in any dramatic confrontation or heroic action, but in simple attentiveness. He had listened carefully, noticed inconsistencies, and trusted his judgment. These ordinary virtues, cultivated over decades of professional work and human interaction, had proven sufficient to expose a carefully trained intelligence operative. This was the real lesson of the case, that sometimes the most sophisticated threats could be countered by the most basic human qualities: attention, curiosity, and the willingness to act on what you observe. As Mitchell entered his final years, he remained quietly proud of his role in the Sokolov case. He had served his country in a small but meaningful way, contributing to the vast, largely invisible effort to protect American security during the Cold War's final decade. He had done so not through any special training or exceptional abilities, but simply by being good at his job and paying attention to the people around him. In a conflict fought largely in shadows and secrets, these qualities had proven unexpectedly valuable, demonstrating that ordinary citizens pursuing ordinary professions could play vital roles in extraordinary circumstances. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.